In the spring of 1381, in a village called Brentwood, in the county of Essex, England, a tax collector arrived with soldiers and demanded something no village should ever be asked to give. England was at war with France, a war so long that history would name it the 100 Years' War. To pay for it, the crown invented a tax on heads, not on land, not on wealth, on people. A duke paid what a plowman paid, and the plowman had nothing. So the villages did what desperate people do. They hid. Fathers left grown daughters off the rolls. Sons were written down as children. And when the treasury noticed England had mysteriously lost a third of its adults, it sent armed men. In Brentwood, the collectors decided they would prove which girls were adults by examining their bodies. They called them virginity tests. They had nothing to do with age and everything to do with power, because the men with the swords believed a village of unarmed farmers could never stop them. They were wrong. A baker named Thomas Baker from the neighboring village of Fobbing stood up. He gathered the men of the villages, walked out to meet the king's officer, and said plainly, "You will not take one more penny from these people." The officer ordered him arrested, him and the 100 men standing behind him. The villagers answered with their fists, and the soldiers ran. The next day, the officer came back with more soldiers. This time the baker and his farmers met them with axes and hammers. 6 of the king's men died in the road. The rest fled, and the news traveled, village to village, county to county, until all of England was on fire, because the tax was never the real wound. It was only the last one. Europe in that century ran on a system of ownership called serfdom. A serf was not quite a slave, and not quite a free man. He could own a few things, but he himself was sold with the land he worked, like a fence or a well. He could not marry or marry off his daughter without permission from the man who owned the field, and for weeks every year he worked that field for nothing at all. The men who owned the land were nobles or churchmen. Then came the plague. 30 years before Brentwood, the Black Death killed roughly half the people of England. Half the workers were gone. The fields were not. So every survivor now did the work of 2. By any honest logic, wages should have doubled. Instead, Parliament passed a law making it illegal to raise a peasant's pay. Then the war tax on top of it. Plague, bondage, and taxes. And they carried all 3 for years in silence. What they would not carry was soldiers putting hands on their daughters. So they took up their tools and they marched on London. On the throne in London sat a boy, Richard II, 14 years old. His grandfather, Edward III, killed that lover, locked his mother in a nunnery, and declared the war on France that would still be running when the peasants reached the city gates. The rebels did not blame the boy. A child, they said, cannot be guilty. They blamed 3 men. First, the treasurer, Robert Hales, a warrior monk who led the Knights Hospitaller in England, an order born in the Crusades, grown rich on land, on the peasants tied to it, and on tax records. 16 years earlier, Hales had sailed with the King of Cyprus to sack Alexandria and carried away 5,000 captives to be sold in Europe. Second, the Chancellor, Simon Sudbury, Archbishop of Canterbury. Its priests taught that serfdom was God's own design, that he had made men in ranks, some owning others, that the king was his choice, and that to rebel against the crown was to rebel against heaven. When a preacher named John Ball stood in the fields and said that Adam and Eve worked with their own hands, that neither was owned and neither owned anyone, Sudbury threw him in prison. The rebels broke him out. Third, the king's uncle, John of Gaunt, who actually ran the country. Within days of the baker's stand, the roads filled. Farmers came from every direction, burning the abbeys where the landlords in robes kept their ledgers, destroying the tax rolls inside, and moving toward London. And London was empty of soldiers. The army was in France. Only the king's household guard remained. His herald told them to disperse. They asked to speak to the king face to face. The boy turned the boat around, so they crossed the river themselves. entered the capital, and burned his uncle's palace to the ground, looking for him. But John of Gaunt was away and escaped. There they gave him 4 demands: end the tax, guarantee free trade, abolish serfdom and forced labor, fix the rent of land at 4 pence an acre, and pardon every man who had marched. The frightened boy agreed to all of it at once. They asked for it in writing, and they asked for 2 men, Hales and Sudbury. He did not dare refuse. The rebels walked to the Tower of London and found the gates standing open, no resistance, which convinced them the young king was truly on their side. Against his ministers, they took the treasurer and the archbishop, and they killed them. For most of the farmers, that was enough. The king had promised. The laws were signed. The corrupt ministers were dead. Most of them went home, against the warnings of their leader. Their leader was a roofer, a man who laid tiles, known to history as Wat Tyler. Walter the roofer begged them not to leave, because their only real protection was their number, their weapons, and their grip on the city. Was he not only a boy, innocent, badly advised? So the multitude drifted home, and Walter was left with a few hundred men. Then he asked for a second meeting. Richard agreed, but this time the king knew exactly how few they were, and how divided. The 2 sides lined up, and the boy and the roofer rode out between them to talk. Walter asked for everything now. Freedom for every serf in England, the abolition of the aristocracy, no lords owning land and people, no titles left in the kingdom but the king's own, and all men equal beneath him. The church stripped of its estates and its ranks, with John Ball made Archbishop of Canterbury, local judges appointed from the village they judged, local constables from the village they policed, and the wealth of the nobles and the churchmen divided evenly among the people. He said all this, calling the king brother, tossing his dagger from hand to hand, and Richard agreed, asking only that the people still respect their king. Walter accepted. Then, as it ended, a servant of the king shouted, "Walter, I know you. You are a thief out of Kent." Walter turned and told him to come forward and say it to his face. The servant did not move. The Lord Mayor of London did. He rode in, struck Walter in the neck, and the roofer went down. The king's men carried him to a hospital in a nearby priory. The peasants drew their bows and raised their axes. They could have destroyed Richard and his guard that afternoon. They did not, because in their eyes the boy was innocent, and on their side. He was their lawful king, and he had promised. Their friends had gone home with those promises in writing. Richard rode toward them and shouted, "I am your king. You shall have no captain but me. Follow me to Clerkenwell Field." And they followed. And the moment they were far enough from him, the king's men dragged Wat Tyler out of that hospital, alone, and cut off his head. They raised it on a spear and carried it to the armed force Richard's men had quietly assembled. The peasants saw the head of their leader on a pole, and the soldiers closing in, and they dropped their weapons, knelt in the grass, and surrendered. As for the 60,000 who had gone home, trusting a written promise, the king revoked every law he had signed the day before, and sent death squads after them. And Thomas Baker, the brave baker who started it all, because he would not let soldiers touch the daughters of his village, was hanged. Richard had planned the betrayal from the beginning. Even the field may have been a message. Clerkenwell held a church and a well belonging to the Hospitallers, the order of the Crusader treasurer the rebels had killed, a church they had burned the day before. He was a pious boy and a lover of symbols, and winning like this at 14 taught him something dangerous, that he was extraordinary, that he had beaten an army alone, because the ruler exists first in the imagination of the ruled. And so does the revolution. A revolt that is not complete in the imagination of the rebels will never be complete on the ground. If you want to bring down a system, the picture of what replaces it must be finished in your mind before you begin. The ruled must imagine themselves without the ruler, and then imagine themselves ruling, and no system falls while any part of it remains standing. The Peasants' Revolt, for all its violence, was a revolt of reform. The people never imagined a different order. They asked the rulers to behave better. The rulers promised, soothed them, and they went home. They sold their revolution for a promise, and it killed them. Richard contained them. He removed a few instruments of his own system, gave them a symbolic salute, told them he was one of them, and so he divided them, thinned them, and destroyed them. They were not fools. They simply were not radical enough. They were merciful to men who had never been merciful to them. And a 14-year-old boy, not necessarily a clever one, defeated 60,000. 6 centuries, friends. And we still have not learned